During our Christmas break, I found myself at an old friend's party. The gathering promised alcohol and drugs. So naturally, I was there to partake in the festivities. This friend lived in a town a few miles away, and I had arrived with some companions, initially planning to spend the entire night. However, as the night wore on, I had a sudden longing for the comfort of my bed. It was very late by this point, and the others were already deep into their intoxication. Realizing that the only way to get home was to walk, I braced myself for what I knew would be a long journey. Just to provide some context, I later checked the distance, and it turned out to be approximately 3 miles from my friend's house to mine. In my inebriated state, though, I was undeterred and determined to reach my cozy bed. To accompany me on this snowy December night in central New York, I had my trusty Zune. Now, it's important to note that during my high school days, I was a rather large fellow, standing at 5 feet 11 inches and tipping the scales at around 330 pounds. I wasn't too concerned about maintaining a clean-shaven appearance, so I sported a beard reminiscent of Fidel Castro, a look I even replicated for a Halloween costume a few years later. Yes, I'm being quite literal about it. Additionally, regardless of the weather, I had a penchant for wearing basketball shorts. Part of it was due to my preference for comfort, and the other part was my ability to withstand the cold. It just didn't bother me much. As I trudged along for about a mile into my walk, it must have been nearing 3 in the morning. That's when an unaccompanied woman in her early 30s pulled up alongside me in her car. She claimed to be concerned about my well-being, which I could understand given my rather unusual appearance at that moment. She insisted repeatedly that I accept a ride from her, but I declined, feeling perfectly content with the cold and my music. I told her I was fine, but she adamantly refused to take no for an answer. This is when I began to feel uneasy about the situation. Despite my youth, I understood how I appeared a large guy with a substantial beard, walking down a county highway in the dead of night. I probably looked exactly like the kind of person you're cautioned to avoid. Her relentless insistence on offering me a ride felt menacing. A problem, however, was that even on this 40 mile/hour speed limit stretch, this woman chose to follow me, driving just a bit behind me, matching my walking pace. Periodically, she would pull up alongside me, offering a ride yet again. At one point, I grew frustrated and decided to accept the ride, but as I approached her car, she instructed me to sit in the back seat. This struck me as bizarre. If this woman genuinely cared about my well-being and was willing to pick up a stranger as unconventional looking as me in the middle of the night, why insist that I sit in the back seat? Thoughts of child safety locks and the unsettling possibility of being inexplicably kidnapped by a woman I outweighed by at least 200 pounds crossed my mind. In the end, I chose not to get into her car. She seemed dissatisfied with my decision and promptly called the police. When the officers arrived, she attempted to persuade them that I needed a ride home. The police, however, determined that I was old enough to make my own decisions and likely recognized the strangeness of a total stranger making such a demand. They left me to continue my journey without offering me a ride themselves, an option I would have gladly accepted just to escape from the lady. Not much else of note happened, except for the fact that, according to my Google Maps calculations, this woman followed me for nearly 40 minutes as I walked home. By the time I neared my house, her presence had unnerved me to the point where I decided to take a shortcut through a few yards and seek refuge at a friend's place. They had an open-door policy, and I waited there for an hour or so, ensuring she had moved on. To this day, many aspects of this experience remain puzzling. Why would a lone woman in the middle of the night feel the absolute need to pick up a big, scruffy-looking guy like me, but insist that I sit in the back seat? Where could she possibly have been going at almost 3 in the morning that justified taking an almost hour-long detour just to follow me home? And why did she involve the police to essentially coerce me into accepting her offer? None of it made any sense at the time, and it was genuinely terrifying. I reside in a foreign country, and the sanitary measures against the epidemic in my current location may differ from your own. The incident I'm about to recount occurred in September of this year. I was on a drive from my parents' house to a friend's apartment near our college campus. It was a journey of about an hour and a half, and we had plans to spend the week together, having not seen each other for months. While the incident I'm about to describe isn't directly related to my friends, it's only now, as I recount the story to them, that I realize how perilous the situation truly was. I remember one of them remarking, "This must have been the worst 45-minute drive of my life." Back then, I chuckled at the comment, but looking back, I understand the gravity of it. I set off rather late that day, around 9 p.m. The sun had already set, and I wasn't thrilled about arriving late, but I was quite familiar with the road, having driven it many times before. For some context, it was an hour-and-a-half drive, and I usually made a stop midway in a McDonald's parking lot to have a cigarette break before continuing my journey. I encountered the hitchhiker not long after leaving my parents' house. About 15 minutes into my drive, I spotted him at the exit of a roundabout. He appeared to be a tall, slender man with one of those small shoulder bags men sometimes wear across their chests. At first, I assumed he was in his 20s, possibly dropped off by friends on his way back from a party or some other gathering. It was a rather premature assumption, considering it was still too early for parties to conclude. Nevertheless, that was my initial thought, and I felt a surge of sympathy, prompting me to pull over. I rolled down the passenger window and inquired about his destination. However, I quickly realized that he was older than I had initially surmised, likely in his 30s. His face was extremely pale, and the way he gazed at me sent a shiver down my spine. He confirmed that he was headed in the same direction as my planned midway breakpoint. In all honesty, I'm not entirely sure what was going through my mind at that moment. I replied almost automatically that his destination was on my route, and he promptly opened the car door. Little did I know that the next 45 minutes would turn into a living nightmare. I don't mean to sound overly dramatic, but it truly was a harrowing experience. I realized immediately that I had made a grave mistake when, as we drove away, he clutched his stomach tightly, hunched over in the passenger seat, swaying back and forth, claiming he felt unwell. I offered to roll down the windows for fresh air, but he insisted he needed to take his medication, which he never did. To say that I felt uncomfortable would be a severe understatement. I vividly recall thinking that I had made an irreversible error, and that, whatever happened, I must not stop under any circumstances. My first instinct was to ask if he would be comfortable if I dropped him off at a nearby McDonald's in the city. It had a well-illuminated parking lot, was typically busy until midnight, and offered a quick exit onto a major road. I believe he agreed to this, although it wouldn't have made much difference because I had no intention of stopping anywhere else. I was already thoroughly rattled, though I put on a facade of composure, focusing intently on the road ahead. Throughout this ordeal, he kept talking incessantly. I can't recall the precise order of his statements, but I remember he asked to see my fingernails, to which I responded that I was driving. He apologized and assured me he had never harmed anyone. He mentioned that his girlfriend was furious with him and threatened to end their relationship if he didn't return. He inquired about my destination, what I had planned for the evening, whether I intended to take a long, relaxing bath, if I had a boyfriend, and how we preferred to spend our intimate moments. I declined to answer his personal questions, emphasizing that they were private and that I wasn't comfortable discussing them. He nodded in acknowledgement and divulged that he, too, used to be young before he got arrested. This isn't a typographical error. Those were his exact words. Young until arrested. He insisted twice that we were being followed by other cars and asked if I smoked marijuana, to which I responded negatively. Surprisingly, he offered me a cigarette, and while I appreciated the gesture, I told him it wasn't necessary. He left a cigarette on the dashboard. At one point, he took out his phone, seemingly eager to show me a photograph of himself and one of his mothers, describing her as beautiful. I glanced briefly at the picture, but the image was unsettling. It had multiple straight black lines of broken pixels, and it was reddish on the left side and yellowish on the right. creating a disturbing effect. His frustration escalated because I had merely taken a glance at the photo. He began speaking louder, accusing me of not caring about what he was saying. I responded firmly, "I am listening, but I can't watch because I'm driving." His anger subsided immediately, and he apologized, proceeding to show me another picture. He asked if the car was mine, to which I replied that it belonged to my parents. I fabricated a story, claiming that I had hit a deer the previous week and that I needed to concentrate to avoid further damaging my parents' vehicle. I hoped that this would quell his incessant chatter, but it didn't. At one point, he locked his gaze on me and muttered, "Poor thing." He then abruptly pointed at a road sign, expressing alarm, and said, "I meant the road sign. Poor road sign." At that moment, I began contemplating that if he attempted anything sinister, I would crash the car into a tree, ensuring that neither of us emerged from the situation unscathed. I feel ashamed to admit this, but I didn't want him to get away with causing me such distress. He identified himself as Archangel Michael and asked for my name, to which I provided a false one. He crouched down again in a state of panic, rocking back and forth, stating that I shouldn't know his name. I simply responded with an affirming okay. Honestly, that was the only response I felt comfortable giving at that point. Ultimately, as we entered the city where he intended to disembark, he asked if I could take him to the train station. It was nearly 10 p.m., and I knew that there would be no trains running, no lights, and certainly no other vehicles or people around. I reminded him that we had agreed he would exit at the McDonald's. He nodded and said, "Yes, yes." He told me I was kind, placing a coin on the dashboard next to the cigarette. I pulled over in the McDonald's parking lot without parking, right in the middle of the well-lit area, where I felt the most exposed. He exited the vehicle, bidding me farewell with a casual "see you later," and I sped away as quickly as possible. I never saw or heard from him again. I sincerely hope you'll never consider giving a ride to a hitchhiker. I certainly won't ever make that mistake again. This tale harks back to the late summer of 1993. I was residing in Montana, but had a boyfriend up in British Columbia, and I frequently made the journey between the two places. Given our financial constraints and lack of a car, hitchhiking became our mode of transportation for longer distances. I had spent the entire month of August with my boyfriend in BC, and it was time to return to school. Unfortunately, I was strapped for cash, and my boyfriend hadn't come through with any money for a bus ticket either. My parents were upset with me, so financial assistance wasn't forthcoming from them either. My circle of friends was also financially challenged, and besides, we didn't even have a phone to reach out to them. We were living in a 2-room cabin tucked away in the mountains, sans running water. The only phone in the vicinity was a shared party line belonging to our neighbors, and it was strictly for emergencies. A decision had to be made. I was already 2 days overdue for school, and I couldn't fathom the idea of panhandling for a bus ticket. I needed to return and couldn't afford to wait around for my boyfriend's promised money to magically appear. This marked my inaugural solo hitchhiking adventure. I packed my backpack with essentials, ensuring I had my IDA lesson. I had learned the hard way when we once hitched to the border, left Canada, and tried to enter the US, only to realize I had left my ID behind in Canada. This left me stranded, with no proof of entry into the US, and no ID to re-enter Canada. But that's a story for another day. For the most part, the journey started quite smoothly. An elderly couple kindly picked me up as soon as I descended from the mountain into town and graciously chauffeured me to Creston near the border crossing. I crossed the border on foot and was promptly picked up by a man who initially gave me a mild case of the creeps. However, all he did was offer advice on the perils of solo hitchhiking and how much I reminded him of his daughter. He graciously drove me to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, covering nearly half the trip. I was genuinely having exceptional luck. After exiting the city limits, I stood on the roadside, thumb outstretched. An hour passed, then 2. When hitchhiking, you often walk at a slower pace, and at one point, I stumbled upon a small piece of cardboard. I picked it up, thinking I could use it at the next exit, borrow a marker at a gas station, and craft a sign to increase my chances of catching a ride. I started walking a bit faster, carrying the cardboard with me. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I tensed up, turned my gaze, and spotted a slim, 2-foot-long snake attempting to cross the cement guardrail onto the shoulder. It was clear he wouldn't make it. He was struggling to fling himself over sideways. I had a soft spot for snakes and deemed this one harmless. Using my sign as a makeshift shovel, I gently nudged him over the guardrail. In retrospect, I should have recognized the snake as a foreboding omen. Before I could reach the next exit, a car pulled to a halt. It's always an eerie moment when a car stops and you approach it cautiously, attempting to discern whether it's a friendly stranger or someone more sinister. My heart always sank slightly when it turned out to be a lone man, but I soon realized he wasn't alone. There was a child in the front seat, appearing to be around 10 to 13 years old. The driver was overly friendly, but after all, what could he do? Commit a crime in front of a child? I decided to get into the car, and the driver engaged in casual conversation, introducing the child as his nephew. He explained that they were on a journey from Seattle, where they had been visiting his brother, back to their home in St. Louis, so the child could visit his grandmother. The child remained relatively silent, as far as I can recall, although it's been quite some time. The drive was about 3 hours from Coeur d'Alene to my destination in Montana, and he was following Highway 90, which would take us right through the town where I lived. I was relieved that I wouldn't have to disembark and rely on hitchhiking again. For the first hour, the conversation was amicable, filled with anecdotes about family and general small talk. The switchblade my boyfriend had given me was discreetly nestled in my palm, up my sleeve, and out of sight. But eventually, the driver's questions took a more distasteful turn, asking whether I had a boyfriend, describing his qualities, inquiring about our preferences, and even discussing intimate positions. I was taken aback and silently panicked. My instinct was to keep up the conversation while I pondered my escape plan. I was fairly certain that the drink he had in the cup holder, concealed within a convenience store cup, contained more than just soda, as his demeanor grew progressively looser during the journey. He continued to ask inappropriate questions, and I felt embarrassed for his nephew, but I continued to play along, attempting to breathe deeply to avoid an anxiety attack and focusing on a strategy to extricate myself from the situation. I was also aware of his increasing inebriation due to the drink in the cup holder. Things took a darker turn when he made it explicit that he expected sexual favors from me in exchange for the ride, referring to it as door-to-door service. Then, it took an even more unsettling twist when he suggested that I find one of my girlfriends for his nephew. He delivered this request with a sinister and hyper-cheerful smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I had to distance myself from this man as quickly as possible. At this point, we were approximately 20 minutes away from my hometown. I put on my most seductive smile and told him, "You know what? I'm sure my friend is at home right now. Let's head straight to her place when we arrive in town and kickstart this date." So, I convinced him to take my exit and suggested we buy some beer for our rendezvous. In Montana, you could purchase beer at gas stations. So I had him pull over at a convenience store a few blocks from my residence. As he reluctantly went inside to buy beer, which I knew was located in the back of the store, I seized the opportunity. I quickly opened my car door and sprinted down the alley for about a block, finally diving into a dense thicket of bushes, curling up as tightly as I could, and waiting in anxious anticipation. My switchblade was now out of my sleeve, but still in my possession. I was trembling, my heart pounding so violently that I feared it might burst. I tucked my head into my knees and listened intently for the sound of his car coming down the alley. Corpse, the gas station stop occurred around 4 p.m. in September, so there was still plenty of daylight. I remained concealed in those bushes until nightfall, then made my escape. His car never ventured down the alley, but I could hear him calling out for me, his voice tinged with anger. I hurried to my front door, locked it securely, and collapsed inside, covered in dirt and leaves. My roommate was understandably bewildered. asking, "What happened to you?" I shared the abridged version of the ordeal, to which she responded, "Why didn't you call me? I would have picked you up at the border."